let's get started on our interactive panel discussion. I'd like to introduce Deanne Milligan, who is today's moderator. Deanne.
Thank you. I am Deanne Milligan. I probably am the oldest living person in Indialantic who's lived here since I was a child. I came here at 3 months. My mother, and you don't clap for my age. I've taken that line from my mother. I would like to introduce my panel to you, and I must tell you there are so many people we could have had on this panel that have contributed to Indialantic, and some of them are sitting here, and I'm going to introduce them also. My sister, Marcia Hoskins, Littlejohn. My best friend, Kitty Fletcher, Hay. My next best friend, Mary Carol Gleason, Pointer. We all grew up together. My next best friend, Shag Katri. My next best friend, Mary Jacobus Roberts. My next best friend, who's in trouble with me because I only heard from you this morning, Ronnie Constantino. My next best friend, Dory Fredrickson, little Danny Abbott, little John McNeil, who are the second generation. So that's the panel that we have today. Sitting here are people that are absolutely important to Melbourne, to Indialantic. I'll tell you about that in a minute. Kay Kovac, who, as we were growing up, had our children in plays everywhere, all over the community. But the best thing she ever did for me, she did plays in the Orlando Park at night, Shakespeare. And it was phenomenal. And it was, and that's what Kay, you contributed a lot. Kent Broom, whose father was on the first council. Nell Musler, who was married to the son of one of the second mayor, and Lois Musler, but Robinson is what I need. Okay, so those are Muslers, and Musler was a big part in the town community. Over here is Karen Rayleigh, who's a historian, a true historian, but she spent a lot of time in Indialantic. Next to her is Anne Hayward Kaler, Mary Hayward's daughter, Mary and Walter Hayward's daughter. And so she grew up here, right? Yeah, you two have talked. Then we have a historian, John Thomas, who's also here. John Thomas was the truant officer when we grew up. Sorry about that, wasn't he? Oh, this is one of the Kovacs. This is Marcia, and there's KK, Wendy, Robin. I mean, blah, 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 blah. And that's why I taught school for 48 years. Kay Kovac probably taught more kids than I did in her house. So I had a hard time thinking about what to say to open this. So I wrote things down, and I hope I can do it because I'm a little bit nervous. History was my worst subject. Organization was probably my second worst subject. No one on this panel is a historian. No one on this panel has bothered learning dates and facts and stuff and writing them down. I may be speaking out of turn, but most of us have memories of a town that we loved, of a community that we loved, that we grew up in. We can tell you the things that we remember, that we loved about our community. They may be accurate. We will try to be truthful, but we will do the best to share with you our love of a community that we have lived in. And to show you what I want you to do to bring our community back to that, I'm going to tell you a very short story. The other night, 2 nights ago, Kitty Fletcher and I were standing in front of my house talking, and a car went in and out of all the driveways along Riverside Drive, obviously looking for something. And so, being an old Indialantic resident, drove by, I said, "Do you all need some help?" And they sped up a little bit and said, "We're looking for an address." So I thought, oh well. So Kitty and I went on talking. It was about 8:30 or 8:45 at night, and the next few minutes, the car came back. 2 very unattractive girls, I actually didn't see them, but in my mind they're unattractive, leaned out of the window and shouted, "If we want help from 2 old women, we'll ask for it." And Kitty and I just stood there thinking, well, I want to go back now to when the town was incorporated. And we had our second mayor, Mr. Fogg, and he got the very first police chief Indialantic had ever had. And the town members, all the people that lived in Indialantic, were furious. And do you know why? There was no crime. We didn't need a police chief. And they couldn't understand why he was spending that money. But this was a town where everybody helped each other, where you could walk down the street and you were never afraid. That's the kind of town we want to have now. All right, moving along. I would like to start, and we encourage you to add to our stories because we're hoping we're going to trigger things you remember, because there are so many of you here who have been here. We encourage you to add to what we say. So if you have a story to tell, please raise your hand so we can get your story. Marcia, tell us what you remember about growing up here.
One of the things that I must say, though, before I even started, that since Deanne is my sister, and she is the oldest living inhabitant, that means I might be the second oldest longest living inhabitant. But I was born in 1938, and of course she was born in 1903 or something like that. But we do have a lot of fun. We have a lot of memories growing up. And when Deanne asked me to join her on the panel with all these really great old friends, I thought, I don't even remember that much. And then all of a sudden I started looking back, and I looked at some of Mom's old pictures, and then we started talking. And then, of course, Deanne and I started arguing because my sister is the one who wrote my mom's obituary in the local newspaper.
Move on, Marcia.
And she said that my mother could change a flat tire in less than 2 minutes. Mother didn't even know how to probably start the car. But what it was the old Army Air Corps that was here, the Red Cross Air Corps or whatever it was that Barbie Bancroft, and they all learned to do so much of that. But growing up in Indialantic truly was so wonderful. I absolutely feel that Indialantic is my town. And when I hear a New York accent as vice mayor, I thought, oh my golly, we have indeed come a long way. But I have to say that if it weren't for so many of those wonderful people that came down from New York, New England, Washington, all over the country, we would not be what we are today. So I am a great proponent of growth if it's done gracefully. And I think Indialantic truly has grown so gracefully. But growing up as a child, we just knew everybody. And you just couldn't get in any trouble because everybody knew you and everybody called your mom and dad if you got in trouble. So it was just one of those things that we loved and adored. And I look back on some of the Naval Air Station, which of course was out where now the Melbourne Airport is, and then the Banana River Air Station, Banana River Naval Air Station, was up where now Patrick is. So we were really surrounded by military, but wonderful, fabulous military. And I don't know if any of you old-timers remember Uncle Johnny Shantz. And he was Captain Shantz from the Naval Air Station, a real good friend of Aunt Barbie Bancroft's. And of course, Captain Andy Anderson and their 6 daughters that we all grew up with and enjoyed so much. But what we did as growing up, Deanne said, think about what we did as entertainment. The only thing I can remember that is so outstanding about growing up in a small, beautiful community where my grandfather built the first wooden bridge, and his name was Cowan-Hoven, Cowan-Hoven, and it was Cowan-Hoven's Folly. Not Hoven, not Cowan, but Cowan-Hoven. He was Dutch, and the entire name, I don't know, did they ever put the thing back on the bridge?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Took a long time. Bill Nelson ignored my calls. I can't imagine why, since I'm a staunch Republican. But it does mean that one of the things that we go back in time, and I know we just have a little bit of time, but when I go back in time, the most important thing to me growing up was family, much unlike what is going on in the world today. All of our parties, and I don't know if Deanne remembers it, but all of the parties with the Andersons and everybody we knew, the kids went with them. We all had family. We went out to, remember when we went out to to the Andersons, and we'd have these parties where the kids would pretend and play, and we'd have a little play. Now, of course, I don't know what the adults did on the nights that we were tucked in bed and where they went to their parties, because I'm sure they had parties as well, but it was all family. We used to go to the beach, and our beach was, of course, the greatest recreation in the whole wide world, the Bahama Beach Club, all of you remember. Ann Hayward, you remember all of that. Going down to the Bahama Beach Club and watching now this was a little bit later, watching the very first nighttime missile, watching, of course, when John Glenn went around, and came back, and then we'd watch some of the stuff go down into the ocean. But we watched that, and we watched us grow so beautifully. But one of the things about friends and knowing that our kids, most of our friends came down, if they weren't living here, they came down and visited from up north. So there again, we had that influence. And I'm going to just look down here because we remember in so many cases when we went to the beach, we would have bonfires. Can't do that anymore. But we would have marshmallow roasts. We'd have fish fries with Uncle Sandy Earl out here on the causeway with the hot air balloons. He would always put up a hot air balloon. But it was all family and wonderful, wonderful opportunities. Tradewinds Hotel was probably one of the most exciting things because that in itself brought down Lloyd Ecclestone. And if it weren't for Lloyd Ecclestone, we wouldn't have what we have here. Outsoffs, Rudy Outsoff, great developer. Judy Outsoff, my very dearest friend, they did live on the other side. Well, they lived over here first.
Well, let me just interject something. And before 52, this was all part of the Melbourne community. Indialantic didn't have grocery stores. Indialantic didn't have filling stations. Everything that we depended on was Melbourne. We had our own wells. We had our own septic tanks. But we depended on Florida Power and Light for our electricity. But everything that we had, Kemper's grocery store in downtown Melbourne delivered groceries to Mother and Daddy over in Indialantic. Those were the good days with charge accounts.
And also, she interrupts me all the time. Even on my radio show, she interrupts me. But she's absolutely right. We depended on so much. But do you remember Mother, my mom, who grew up in the house right over there, which is no longer there, actually, when she went to school there, she would hang a big white sheet out in the front, or her mom and dad would, Ernest Cowenhoven, and they would come across in a little boat and take her back over to Melbourne High School, or Melbourne School. So that was before the bridge was even there. So we were all dependent on Melbourne. But just to go very quickly, we went through the period of when the astronauts came and they would hang out at the Bahama Beach Club, and we met every single one of those original 7 astronauts, and of course got to know them. There were sailors that Deanne doesn't want me to tell about a story, and I won't.
No.
I won't.
Tell the story about the panty thief. That was our only crime
There was
ever
a panty thief. Do you all remember the panty thief? The guy that they...
In Indialantic.
He went around all over... Do you remember that, Ken?
I remember the cat burglar.
The cat burglar. And was it Deanne that said we had no crime?
Well, we didn't. That's 2. But tell them about the panty thief.
We did have a panty thief, and everybody was losing because we hung the panties out, your laundry out on the line.
We didn't have dryers.
And everybody started missing their underwear. Well, so then we knew that there was a panty thief. They finally found him, and I think it was John Thomas. John Thomas found him. He was the police chief, and not Frank Thomas, but John Thomas. They found him with a pair of panties over his head, incidentally. They put handcuffs on him, and my father decked him. After the guy had his handcuffs on. Daddy was not a fighter, but it was just one of those things. But those were the only crimes that really happened. But we went to movies all the time. We had cotillions. We were very sophisticated. We were not that rural. We had cotillions. We learned how to say yes, ma'am, and no, ma'am, and yes, sir. We had fish fries and roasted marshmallows. So everything was wonderful. There was so much more. Raising family in a small town was great. Riverside Drive. Incidentally, where our causeway is, there used to be those circles of pine trees. Those were all Australian pines. I think they're down now. But they were beautiful as you went across the causeway, and they were all planted by our dad and the JCs. It was just an organization that did that. But there's so much history here, and I could go on and on, and these people are glowering at me, and Deanne's going to interrupt me. But just,
I am.
just a lot of things. World War II was the blackouts where we had to pull our shades down, our blackout shades, that we had to wait for the airplane to go over. Well, nobody here grew up in that day. Who lived on the beach
Chopped
during World War II? On the beach, where you didn't have to pull out your, were they driving? And we've argued all the time too.
Yeah, we did too.
All right, we're going to move along a little. Kitty, I want to ask you a question. There were sulfur pools in, what made me think about it is, I grew up drinking sulfur water. I absolutely love it. I think that's why when Marcia and I ran behind the DDT trucks, sniffing in the DDT, we are still alive because we had sulfur water that negated the DDT. But Kitty, do you remember, there were sulfur pools in Melbourne that people went to swim in. They were at the end of Melbourne Avenue on Front Street. And there were 3 big sulfur pools over there that maybe Indialantic should have some sulfur pools. Kitty,
Wow.
Kitty's father was the first doctor to come to Melbourne and start delivering Marcia.
Dr. Bean.
Dr. Bean delivered you?
Dr. Bean.
But he delivered Mickey Pointer, Mary Carol's husband. So,
No,
Kitty,
Mary
you're
Carol,
on.
Jacksonville. You were delivered in Jacksonville. Yeah, right.
Now, Kitty's name is Hay. Dr. Hay built the first hospital. Lou, was Laura born in the hospital on US 1? And he built that hospital on US 1. Lou West and her daughter Laura, who's here. So,
Well,
go on, Kitty.
that's right. Well, my father came here. Is that? Oh, right. Thank you. You're more experienced at this than I am. When my father came here in 1928, Indialantic did have the wooden bridge that was going across. I think that was built in 1921 or somewhere around there. But anyway, unfortunately, we had the Depression, and my mother and father could not continue with the hospital. They did not have the funds, and later on, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, as you all know, funded a lot of these different projects in the community. And so the government helped fund the hospital that we know, Lou, on US 1, the old hospital. And so everything was put back in order then. But what I, as a child growing up here, remember was I never even was aware that there was a depression. I mean, I know we all seem to be in the same boat. Nobody had any money. So as a result, we didn't go on big vacations or, spend a lot of money in this way. And what I remember was, particularly during the summer, I lived in Melbourne in a house that is on Airport Road, which is now owned by the Academy. And Deanne's grandfather developed that Magnolia Park, as it was called in those days. And there are about 4 or 5 houses in that area that were built in 1925. And here in Indialantic, I think there were quite a few. How many houses were built about that time? One. Okay.
Probably 10.
Yeah,
Probably,
there were.
I don't know.
But what was interesting was that basically, if you have noticed in driving around here, they all had the same Spanish design with the tiles and like Jennifer. Where is Jennifer? Oh, there you are. And Jennifer lives in one of those houses now.
Rufus
and
and Mabel Abbott.
They're just, I understand that they were based on the Palm Beach, who was it? Yeah, Meitzer. And so that was very, very popular. And so it came up here to this area. And so we have quite a few houses with this Spanish design from 1925. And I'm so glad that many of them have been preserved, that people, well, like Denise with the heritage, have taken the time to spend on developing these different projects, so that there are some things left. But anyway, getting back to what I did as a child, was that my mother would drive my brother and sister and myself over to the beach every single day during the summer. And this was like in 1937, 38, 39, 40, till the war came.
I wasn't born then, Kitty.
Actually, you were. You were born in 1903, according to your sister. But anyway, we would come over on that bridge, and I can remember this day that, just thinking, oh my gosh, are we going to go over? Because it was just one single lane, the bridge. And do you remember, did they have rails?
They did not at the beginning, then the rails came later.
That's what I thought.
And it was always on fire.
It was, but it was incredible that none of the cars went over. I mean, I don't.
Oh yeah, Adger Smith went over.
Oh, he did? Oh, okay. Well, then I guess there were. But we'd come over that bridge, and we'd head right down Fifth Avenue. And in the beginning, we used to go to Melbourne Beach, where there was a Melbourne casino with a swimming pool and a clubhouse. But then, when Carl Abbott was with I'm not sure, Dan, about when your grandfather came, but anyway, Carl developed the Indialantic Casino from the tradesmen, and the tradesmen hotel took their guests over to the Indialantic Casino. And somewhere along the line, and I'm not sure I remember this, but the people who lived here were invited to come to swim in that pool in Indialantic Casino. And I know you all have seen all those pictures of the casino. Yeah, that's just, it was just the most magnificent structure. It was enormous, and it also had the Spanish design. But in back of the hotel, or the building, was this enormous swimming pool. And as Marcia said, a big tower. And we would jump off that tower. You remember doing that? You remember? Did you remember jumping off that tower?
It was so nasty.
It was
inside
incredible.
The tower. It was wet concrete.
Oh, it was magnificent.
And dark.
Yeah. Then in back of the swimming pool was an enormous collection of dressing rooms. You remember those? Yes. And we used to play hide and go seek in the dressing rooms, because I don't know where all the guests from the hotel were. I don't remember them being there. Do you? I never saw them.
They were inside complaining about us.
Whatever happened to them. Maybe it was during the summertime, and everything sort of, they went back.
And what neither of these girls are telling you is, and you guys are very lucky today because we have exterminators. There were scorpions. And whenever we went out and put our bathing suits on in our little wooden garages, at least once a month as we walked to the beach, we were stung. It didn't kill you. It didn't do anything. It just hurt.
No.
But we had scorpions. I mean, they were, Ann, do you remember scorpions here? Oh, you must be too young. You probably didn't have a wooden garage.
But anyway, that area where that casino was had a tremendous impact on my life, because I spent most of my childhood over there on the beach. And as Marcia was saying, it was like family. We would all go over there, and our parents would leave us unsupervised. We all survived. We never had a shark bite. We never got caught in the riptide.
We had one, the best boy, was
but that was
bitten.
only one. But anyway, with this casino, then in the 1940s, it was taken over and became the Bahama Beach Club that we've been talking about. And that also was very nice. It was a restaurant, and maybe some of you, did anybody here ever have a meal there? Oh
Sure.
my gosh, look.
Marcia had her wedding
Well, that's
reception there.
great. And you remember the bar overlooking the ocean, and it was really nice. Then that was torn down, and there was supposed to be a Holiday Inn built there, hotel, and that did not materialize. And as you all know now, it's the James Nance Park. And I was just thinking,
But Kitty,
how
do you
wonderful.
remember?
Am I finished?
No, I'm interrupting.
Oh, well, I've got
Do
it.
you
Okay.
remember
But
that-
one thing I just want to say.
Wait a minute. Down to the side of the Bahama Beach Club were 4 little buildings that had a sundry.
Yeah, all
All
right.
right, just go ahead, go ahead. Brownings and all those little places along there.
The VFW
Yeah.
hall was on the corner.
Yeah.
And the Feingold's had their little French cafe.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
We were right across the street.
Nobody has talked about Murph the Surf.
Oh, but we will. We'll get to that as we get down there, I bet.
We're going, can you tell, we have this in order, but I can't get these people
Well,
to be quiet.
as you can see, I can go on and on. The one other thing I want to mention is that at the Bahama Beach Club, that was the center of social activities. And Deanne, that's your picture of all of us back there. We had cotillions there, and you could look at, Mary Carroll, and we were all back there. And actually, we had wedding receptions, and I had my wedding reception there 50 years ago. So, yeah.
And she's still with us.
I'm still here. Well, it's enough. That's enough.
Well, we'll come back to you. Now, this is Mary,
no, that's all right.
this is my, she's a lot older than I am. Now, she truly is older than I am. This is my friend Mary Carroll Gleason Pointer. Her father is Lansing Gleason. And I'm going to I digress for a minute. I had all kinds of little things I want to interject. But our parents, Kitty's parents, Danny's mom and dad later on, but all of them played poker every Thursday night. The men played and the women played. And then they would come home and Marcia and I would say to Daddy, "Did you win?" And he would always say, "I broke even." So we have no idea, but our parents all played poker every Thursday night.
The women played and the men played
Right.
separately.
Oh, there was a very distinct woman and men world at that time. Mary Carroll was from O'Galley. You may talk.
A diehard. Well, my next best friend, Deanne Hoskins Milligan, assured me I would not have to talk this morning, number one, because I said I will not sit up there and talk. So I shall be very, very brief. And the wooden bridges, bring back many fond memories. And I just remember the clatter, of going across the bridge. It's funny what sticks in your mind about these things. And I'm a horse lover from way back, so we always had horses, and we did have some pasture land west of O'Galley, but we also would ride the horses into town to our house in O'Galley and kept them there, right there at the house. We didn't have any stable or anything like that, but just a rope around their neck, probably not even a halter, tied to a tree.
You have to realize their
things.
house is on Pineapple on the river.
And the reason I was not born here was because my mother was from Minneapolis, and she said, "I'm going to have my children in a big hospital. I don't want to have them in a little hospital in Melbourne." So they took an apartment, I guess, a few weeks before the babies were due, and we were all born in Jacksonville, unhappily. And I remember, Marcia and Kitty have done a great job, and they bring back to mind so many things about that diving board at the Bahama Beach Club. I mean, it was up in an enormous amount. And, of course, everybody had to go up there, and I went up there, and I just was terrified. There's nothing but space under me, and the little board is about that big, wide, and I couldn't do it. I walked back and would not go down. And my mother was furious. She said, "You never do that. Once you get on that diving board, you have to go on." I said, too bad.
Well, she's a Gleason. She married a Pointer. And those are two old families here. So really, when I was thinking about it, none of us were married to one another except those guys. And so you've got the Pointer family that that's why all.
That's because Mickey was the only male. We were all.
No, Carl Abbott.
Carl Abbott. That's
Oh,
right.
but she
Mickey
dated
didn't
him
live here
too.
all the time.
Right.
He didn't live here all the time.
But she rode horses with him too, but
It was just one.
And then Lee Beadle, does anybody remember?
Carol got them.
All right, so on the back counter back there is a picture of all of us in front of the Bahama Beach
right.
Club when we were seniors in high school.
Joel.
And Mary Carroll and Kitty, Diana Berg, Lee Beadle, they were all in that picture back there. We were slim and young. And Joel Walker. All right, but now we're going to move to the next generation. Does anybody want to interject something? We have Kay Kovac. Would you like to tell us about in that era? Lou? I can remember Lou West because I took B to the movies with me at the Van Croy on US 1. And Laura. And Laura was B's, how old? Well, B was a couple of years younger than you are. We lined up inside the theater to see Snow White or something. It was terrifying. And I took all the children, they were all sitting there, and all of a sudden I looked down, and B, who was tiny, is sitting, and the seat has closed up on her, and nothing but two eyes are showing above the seat. I took her over to Lou, I said, I've done her damage for the rest of her life. But we did go to the Van Croy, and Kitty worked at the Van Croy, and she let us in free. It was 10 cents, and they had, every Saturday there was a continuation of things. We're going to get to that in there, yeah.
And just real quick about the beach tender.
Oh, the bridge tender. Yeah. This is Kay Kovac.
The bridge tender tended to everybody's affairs. And he was on my telephone. It took me years to get him off my telephone. He took all my messages and called me very well later and told me what the people said and what they were doing and all about them, but he took all my messages. So anyway, he would call up, and so one day he called up and he said, I don't know what to do. He said, something terrible's happening to your children. And he said, and I can't figure it out because they're crying so hard. Well, I had a daughter away at Palm Beach at school, so I was horrified. So I immediately called her. Well, she was hysterical. Everybody had come in her room to talk to the beach tender, to the bridge tender. And they were all dying laughing. And he thought that they were all having something terrible happen to them. But anyway, that kind of thing went all the time. He took all my messages. Very well, the next day he would tell me how many I had and what they said. So.
Can I interject something?
Sure. This is Kent Broom.
Right after she got off the party line with a bridge tender, they gave him to us. And you never could get the phone. Because every time you picked the phone up, that bridge tender was yakking to somebody. And he'd be talking to the bridge tender in our galley, telling him, wait till you see what's on this next boat coming up here. She's gorgeous.
In fact, we were talking about that, John and I were, because we said we grew up here, and probably Ann and the rest of you remember this. The bridge, the original bridge that I remember, the man came out of the little building where he lived, and he put oh, I don't need this. He put a machine. He put a little machine in the drawbridge, and we would pull up. There were no things that went down, and we would jump out of our car and stand on the bridge, and it would turn around, and we would ride it out while the boat went through. It was one long and two short? Two shorts and a long, and that would tell the bridge tender to open it. Much later, they then got on the hour and a half hour, but initially when that bridge was there, Marilyn, do you remember that? I mean, you were here. Marilyn you were here at that point, you and Ray. 54. Okay, we're going to move along. Does anybody else have something else to interject in the before we incorporate it? Oh, John, I'm sorry I wanted you to talk. He's going to answer to John, because that's what I do today. I know. Tom?
Hi, I'm Frank Thomas, and I wanted to just note a couple of things that were just said. The Indialantic, a charming community. These two are available to the Indialantic Heritage Committee in the park, and these are reprints that I did 5 years ago, and of course the donations are going to the park. And they were speaking earlier of the original homes in Indialantic, and they're all in here.
Oh, that's wonderful.
And these are available for them from the Heritage Committee, and in the park that will be coming up. I just wanted to interject that. There are two of them on the original Indialantic 1925. The other is, you were speaking of the Indialantic, the Bahama Beach Club. They bought it, the town of Indialantic bought it in October of 1968 for $110,000, 300 feet on the ocean front. And this is a news clipping. I collect these things. I'm a local historian, and this is just stuff I happen to have brought to this occasion.
You can believe what he says.
I'll leave it with that, and maybe later I'll talk about Bob Horn a little bit.
Well, no, go ahead and talk about him right now. He was a mayor.
Okay. I did want to note that Bob Horn was, I believe, the founder of the Indialantic Art Show. This is later. Is that correct? Or does somebody else claim it? I think Bob Horn was the mayor, and he had the Pink Porpoise, if you remember the Pink Porpoise, the bookstore. I am an inveterate writer of letters to the editor, and in 1979, when he died, I wrote an epitaph for Bob Horn in the local newspaper, in the Melbourne Times. And I'll read the part of it. And it said, Bob Horn of Indialantic died last week. He will be missed in South Brevard, for he was a unique person for whom the epithet character applies in the best sense of the word. In the 50s and 60s, Bob owned and ran the only bookstore in the area, the Pink Porpoise, at the corner of A1A and North Wavecrest in Indialantic.
I'm going to stop you right there. There
Okay,
is
that's
no, you can go on. On the table back there is a Pink Porpoise ashtray that Mary Jacobus, and a picture of Bob, or, yeah.
Okay, Bob's back there. Okay, I'll get quiet on this. And I simply wanted to say that he was seemed to be a fine mayor, and it's a long story on him.
He was a great person. He was a character. Thank you very much. All right, I'm going to introduce you to the next section. How many of you in here remember or have had kids who surfed? Okay, how many of you knew Murph the Surf? He was, and this is the Murph the Surf that you all have read about, who was a notorious criminal. But he came to Indialantic, and my mother, who was very straight, thought he was fabulous. And he came in on a Santa Claus uniform on a surfboard and gave out candies to the children. You have one of the lollipops, and yeah, you probably do too, because you were that thing. And then unfortunately, he did end up with a very bad reputation. But cleaning up his reputation was Shag Katree. And she will tell us about surfing in shags.
Thanks. I think I'm the next era that comes along, but just kind of tying in what Frank said, where the Pink Porpoise was in the store that we were when I left, on the corner. And that happened to be the garage of that building. And Rudy Odsorf had built that building as a model home in 1952. So when Indialantic was developing, that was the model home. It was then, I think, an insurance company and that type of thing after that. But that's where Bob Horn was. And then we moved to the corner in 1978, and we were in the building to the east, closer to the beach. And that's where Jack Murphy was. I was not here at that time, but that's where he had his store. And he did things like little Gary Proper, who was probably the first professional surfer that was being paid both in California and in Florida or the East Coast. He probably had the first notoriety. And Jack would have them go out to the side of the building where, I don't know if you remember as kids, the little yellow flowers, they had the little big stickers in them. They called them satellite stickers. And he'd have the kids run through that patch, and that was their initiation to become surfers. So that was kind of the build-up for that. And across the street was the Bahama Beach Club, as you've been speaking about, which was not in operation at the time that we opened our store, and we opened our store in 1965. But across the street was the Fine Golds, Stan Feingold, who had a music career here, and his father, who worked with some of the radio stations, but it was the parents, and they had the little cafe there, and then the VFW hall was on the corner. And then, of course, behind, some of you may remember the Valley High. And the Valley High had a drive-through. So behind us, we would hear cars go through to get their beer, etc., whatever. But I did not grow up here. We arrived in 1965. Dick and I arrived via Hawaii and California, and we thought that we were bringing surfing at its greatest to the area, because we had the hardcore surfers, which there were probably 2 or 3. And when we opened the store, I made bikinis, and I made some of the shorts for the kids right there with my sewing machine in-house. We would buy Penny's Towncraft t-shirts. We'd go over and buy them for $1. And we would come back, and on my ironing board, we would then do the silk screening. So silk screening today, when you see everything on these shirts that they're selling for $20 and $25 a piece, we used to sell them for $2.75 after they dried all night on my ironing board. It was a grand time, and a lot of your kids, of course, came through the store. I'd have to be asked questions, and I could probably come up with some other answers, but we've had some wonderful people go through the doors, and it was a great spot. I grew up with your children. I came here as a young adult, but I did grow up here and had my children in the store. I had a playpen in the store with my kids as I was sewing and that kind of thing. So it was grand.
I would like to ask you about
You may.
your former husband, Dick Cattree, was one of the greatest surfers in the world.
Dick Cattree had his notoriety in Hawaii. He was a big wave rider in Hawaii, and when he arrived here, he created surf teams, and some of the kids, Fletcher Sharp's parents lived here, some kids from Satellite Beach, and of course Gary Proper was on the team at the time, and he took the kids all the way up and down the East Coast with the Surfboards Hawaii surf team, which then became the Hobie surf team, and Dick was instrumental in running and working with the Easter surfing contest that still goes on to this day, and I think they're in their 44th year, something like that, and he still does that. He's one of the original Hall of Fame people that was inducted into the Hall of Fame for the East Coast. That's an ongoing organization and continues to induct people that are involved in the surfing community. I'm done.
Just one more thing about the surfing industry here, because Dick Cattree and Chad Cattree really brought it up to class, but I don't want anybody to walk out of the room thinking that Murph the Surf was anything but rotten, because he was. He was really, really bad. As a matter of fact, when he came to this community, the police had already been informed to watch him, because what they found he was doing in the Bahama Beach Club when they finally caught him with... Well, he was the one who went down into Miami, and he was, what was it, the Turkey Creek?
His first notoriety, or first endeavor in the criminal part, was the theft in the Natural History Museum in New York, which was the Star of India, the DeLong Ruby, and those types of gems that many were never recovered. And then in the South, there was the criminal part of his. I was not here.
Well, I was.
Okay, yeah. I was not here when we arrived. This had all happened prior to. Some of the stories came to me a little bit later on. I was in Hawaii with Dick, and we did get a call, and we did get an FBI agent came to Hawaii to talk to Dick regarding his association with Jack. But I can tell you that all of that, and it is bad, and it is terrible, but to this day, at this point, Jack is involved in the prison ministry with Billy Graham's prison ministry and is traveling around the world to help, or around the country to help. Throughout the 60s and the 70s and 80s, the surf community was not involved with that reputation, and the young people that came out of that were stunning, wonderful, great representatives of the sport. And the greatest one that comes to mind at this point is Kelly Slater, who is one of the best ambassadors to this sport. to this day, he and his 3 brothers travel around the world, 8-time world champion, and that era of negative connotation that comes to the sport really ended. And with the 60s through the 70s, the 80s, the young children and your children that were involved in the sport became one of the best parts of their memories and their growing up. Sorry, Marsha.
That was great, Chad. Thank you so much, because we all remember him. All of us old people remember him in different ways.
My name is Keller Fox. I came here in the end of 53 or so and graduated Mel High in 55. Some of you may remember me. I now live here for the last 13 years. I remember I lived 10 miles down a dead-end road, meaning down by the sea dunes, or what was it called, the lake after the sea dunes, I forget that. Anyhow, down beach. But there was nothing down there except the sea dunes, believe me, nothing, and there was no bridge, so we had to come up the road to Indialantic. I remember, because I spent a lot of time in Indialantic with friends that I had from school, the Beckwiths and Bill Warden.
We have them in the back. Stand up, Beckwiths and Wardens in the back.
Yeah.
Stand up.
Yeah.
Beckwiths and Wardens. Mrs. Warden and Mrs. Beckwith.
Well, I think it was David's father I'm talking about, I believe, and his uncle. But they had the National Realty, one of the original houses built over here, which some people didn't mention, but it's on A1A in Michigan Avenue. Anyhow, I remember one thing I do remember was, I'm not sure when the Texaco station went in, but it was probably 53, because on the corner of A1A and 5th Avenue, where CVS is now, that was, I believe, Stroud's. Am I wrong? Stroud's Texaco. I don't know whether he's Stroud's here or not, but they've been around a long time too. I used them a number of times with their long chain and pulley on the back of their tow truck to pull me off the beach, because you could drive on the beach, just drive through the pines, the big Australian pines, which are all along where the boardwalk is now. You just drove over, or you'd park there at night with your girlfriend and drink beer. But you drive over that and get on the get on the beach and drive on the beach. But sometimes the tide would catch you, and I had to call on Stroud's and their long chain a number of times for $50 a pop, getting out of there. Thanks, man.
Thank you very much. Mary Jacobus Roberts, who grew up here, and her parents came right after the war. Why did they come here?
You'll love it. You'll love this. Larry Culver was a professor of engineering research at the University of Cincinnati and a friend of my dad's. And when he retired, he used his considerable research skills to decide where to retire. And first, he checked out the whole United States and settled on Florida. And then he focused on every part of Florida in terms of quality of life, beauty, temperature. And in the early, middle 40s, he learned what we see all the time now, that there is always that line that goes from Tampa right through to us. And the weather north of that line is always colder in the winter. It's colder north of here. South of here, it's hotter in the summer. We are in a particularly lovely spot. So he picked it, and he lived at 211 8th Avenue, a green, lovely green wooden house, been kept up. And that was the first place we came when we came here on the train in September of '46. And I, as an 8-year-old, ran out on the grass and got sand spurs. Nobody's mentioned sand spurs. And I realized it was a different place. The other reason we came is that the winter of 1945 in St. Johnsbury, Vermont, it went to minus 40 below. And my mother said, "My eyes froze shut and we are moving to Florida." My dad worked with Larry Culver for a couple of years, and then he went with Hal Guerin, who lived at 310 8th Avenue, another beautiful wooden home. And they formed Guerin and Jacobus, and they built luxury homes in this area. They built along Riverside Drive in Indialantic and along Atlantic Avenue in Melbourne Beach. And so I thought I would name some of the houses starting south on Riverside Drive. Just south of that, when you turn the corner there at Fifth Avenue, there's the Brownlees' house, the wooden one. And then there are 5 houses from 204 to 304. The last one there is the Foster's house. And those, at least 3 of those, my dad built. And as is the case with some of the houses he built, only a little bit of it remains. They've been remodeled a great deal. And Bruce remembers when Dad moved over and did a lot of air conditioning work, as air conditioning was coming in the 50s. And his vivid memory is holding the air conditioning gauges at night at the Bahama Beach Club for Dad while they're working on the air conditioning, and he can smell the steaks sizzling, and none of them are for him. I think
Jacobus is a judge in Brevard County.
Judge Jacobus, yes. I think we should mention too Kathy Johnson, who grew up here and whose grandfather taught a lot of our brothers and sisters in school, and the grandfather, Bob Richardson, or Mr. Richardson, lived where the Culvers lived, at 211 8th Avenue. But their granddaughter, Kathy, went on to be a member of the gold medal gymnastics team Olympics in Los Angeles and won a silver individual medal. I'd also like to say hi to Laura West because I taught her in first grade. And I brought the ashtray from Pink Porpoise. Bob Horn gave that to Red and me for a wedding present. And then there's a picture of the Bahama Beach Club there. That's one that Karen, it's one that I got from you, Karen. Yeah. So I'll hand it along.
Okay, the reason they have me here is my husband chickened out. My husband came in 1937 or 38, somewhere around there, when he was a little toddler.
Walter was in my class from first grade to 6th or 8th grade. I stayed till the 8th grade. And he is now the thinnest, tallest, best-looking man. When he was in school, he was 150 pounds. We called him roly-poly, all the way through the 6th grade, so it's shocking to me. I'm now roly-poly, and he's skinny-bitty. All right, go ahead.
I guess that says something for my cooking. Anyway, what I want to tell you about is how Deanne asked me, how did I get here? I came from New York. I had just been going to college in the city in New York City, and came down here to get a job at Radiation. Some of you may have known my cousin Johnny Diaz, who was also working there, and he had a home he had just bought in Almar and needed somebody to help him pay the mortgage. If you knew Johnny, you understood that. Anyway, I came city girl to this area, and I just thought I'd tell you what I saw. You could go to the end of Indialantic on Riverside Drive. You could go north 1 mile, not even 1 mile, because at Watson, the road went, there was no more road. There was a track, and we used to take Johnny's car and bump all the way to the Oak Alley Causeway. There was only one house that had been built partway down the way. A1A had no lights. There were no lights, no street lights anywhere except on Fifth Avenue. So when you got up onto A1A, I didn't want to go anywhere at night with a car, because if you ever had a flat tire, you were out there, the mosquitoes would get you for good. The other thing my engineering husband said, though, about the bridge, the reason the cars were causing they had sparks coming off the engine. This is before all the new emission things. And so these sparks would start the fires on the wooden bridge. So everybody was used to dipping in the water, taking a bucket and putting out the little fire. He said that was half the fun of the bridge. Wanted to mention, Kitty mentioned the movie house. Now, here I am coming from the city. That movie house was something else. What I didn't know, my first date with Walt, by the way, we're talking 1957 that I came to stay. First guy I met at Radiation was Walt, and I was very impressed. He always looked so starched, so neat, clean, drove a brand new 57 Chevy. So, when he asked me to marry him, what could I do? So, it's almost 50 years we've been married. And here we were with this. Well, 10 years later, I still was driving that 57 Chevy with 3 kids in the back. And guess who was starching those shirts?
Dory, I'm going to interject a real quick story that when you were talking reminded me. We used to swim. There was nobody at the beach. So when we went, Mary Carol, Kitty, Marcia, Phyllis Outsoff, a group of us would go down there. We would get in the water, and we were so daring, we'd take off our bathing suits. Because absolutely nobody was on the beach, and and I will never forget the one day Bill Gleason, Mary Carol's brother, came down with Jean Lathrop on the beach, and they wanted us to come out and talk to them. And we couldn't. We were up to here in the water, and we were terrified to move. That doesn't happen today, I don't think.
You carry the strap in your bathing suit and your teeth.
Right.
I also wanted to mention at the end of Pine Tree Drive, actually just north of the Indialantic side, there were a few little rental apartments, and the owner had a daughter who actually had a horse that she used to ride on the beach there, and that was in the 50s. And because my daughter thought that was wonderful and wanted one in her backyard, but we couldn't do that in Indialantic. The other thing I just wanted to mention was Patrick Air Force Base. Some of you heard about the pollution that they found on the south side of the base. When the children were growing up there, my husband's father was a guard at the base. He was part of their security force. And at night, he would take his son back, or on a Saturday, to that junk heap. And my husband could go through it and pick up all sorts of things he would bring back to his mother. And when we went through her old shed, we found steering wheels from planes, all kinds of parts of things that they were allowed to just cart off. It was rather interesting, but it all just was dumped there, apparently. That's about all I've got to say. Thank you. Oh, one more thing. The movie house. Let me tell you about that movie house. When you sat there, it was very nice. But when you left, the raccoons came down and ate up the extra popcorn and all. And they left fleas. So the first time I sat there, I kept thinking, what is wrong? Well, I found out you got used to the fleas. That was part of the deal. And if after your movie you didn't go up to the A&W root beer stand, in 57, my husband couldn't wait to take me up there. This is my first date, and I still married the guy. I'd been wined and dined in New York City. They had new frozen mugs, glass mugs. That was the big thing in town. So it wasn't a very big town, but it had a wonderful beach, and it was a terrific place to raise children.
And as I said to Dory the other night when she was telling that story, I said, but New York didn't have frozen mugs. Melbourne had frozen mugs. Oh, I don't want a New Yorker here.
They didn't have the little bitty ones.
And yours didn't say A&W root beer. Big time. Ronnie, I haven't even had a chance to talk to Ronnie. I've emailed him for weeks. Finally, this morning, I got an email saying I'll be there at 10. So you're on, buddy.
Okay, river rats. I remember there was 2 islands out in the river. There was one big one south of the causeway, and it did have a sulfur pond in the middle of it, by the way, that we used to swim in. It had this big pipe that came out and sprayed sulfur, and it deteriorated. I think in about 68, 69, it started to deteriorate, but we used to. My brother had a 10-foot surfboard, and we would paddle it out there off from the Sewell's dock. And there was another island that was north of the causeway, and but these were really, really pretty little islands that had 1 tree left in it when I remember it. I do remember Murph the Surf at Christmas time paddling out when it was huge, and dressing up like Santa Claus out there and coming in and giving us all candy. And it seemed like the whole town was down at the beach. The guys I remember surfing were like Cotty Williams, the Sharps, the Fridays, and these guys were probably all world-class surfers. They're just, surfing wasn't that popular. But I remember water skiing on the river and sometimes seeing, Gus Grissom, Alan Shepard. I remember the Brooms Dock. That was a famous place. Actually, that's my older brothers, like Hank Eister, and the Traders house, and let's see, Mr. Sheldrick's. We used to all go off their docks because there was deep water there and water ski, and there was oyster beds back then too. I don't even know if there's any oyster beds left, But and let's see. I remember one other thing. I used to have to pay $0.25 to jump on the Milligan's trampoline, and sign a 2-page document that if I got hurt. And then I was fortunate to be around some really great families. The Lanfords, they always had this great party, Christmas party, and I remember Radiation becoming Harris, which was really something, and then watching that all evolve and ended up working there. So it's just been, I could go on and on and on and on, but my generation, I was really lucky to live in this town. I still live here, and I would never leave. It's a great place.
I was glad you talked about radiation because we haven't even touched on what that did to Indialantic. We talked on the fact that Indialantic initially was really tourists, people who were coming down from the cold north and in very small numbers. And then the next thing we felt were the people that came from, in World War II, the military, who impacted our lives in Indialantic. And my mother, our parents were all of our parents were friends with the people from both of the bases. And then after that left, we were kind of quiet for a while until all of a sudden, the base, the Cape started. And we had engineers, and is that how Charlie came down here?
At the base, yeah.
Charlie West, who came down here with Sorba. Well, but he was at RCA?
No, he was with the Air Force, I think.
Was he?
Yeah.
And
he did the data reduction out there.
Okay, and John McNeil.
Yeah.
And the group of these guys all came down, and then they started Sorbonne. They left and came down here together. And then the next group, I think at that point, radiation was already going.
About the same time.
Radiation started, and it was out at the airport. Do you remember that?
Yeah.
Let me get you a mic.
Thanks. Look.
In 1952, I was interviewed in New York to come to Florida to work in the space program. As I sat down for the interview across the guy that was interviewing me, he said, this program that we're speaking to you about, someday we'll be landing a man in the moon. I almost laughed at him, but I wanted the job. So I was hired and came here in 1952. I landed here on the 4th of July weekend, and I drove around. It was impossible to find a place to rent. My wife said, let's go back to New York. I didn't quit my job yet. So on Monday morning, I reported to the personnel department. As I walked in, he handed me a key. He said, this is the key for your house. It's in the Atlantic. And right before you get to inland, they call it Neil Oceantide Villas, those little tiny huts. I think we paid $75 a month to rent there.
75.
But when I got the key, he said, when you leave Patrick Air Force Base, the first building that you will come apart on the right-hand side was these little cottages. Of course, there was one other old gentleman that lived in the beach in between. There was absolutely no homes from the time you left Patrick until you get to these houses. I stopped in and spoke to that old man that was the only person living in the beach halfway between. He said, do you want to buy a lot from me for $1,000 in the beach? Of course, I didn't have $1,000. So, but anyhow, that's history, and thank you.
You were part of it. And you were part of that history.
Did you introduce who he was?
Would you please tell us your name?
Jerry Gonzalez.
And Mrs. Gonzalez.
Yes.
Right. Thank you very much.
I just wanted to say one thing about Ronnie's dad. When they came to town, they were from Rhode Island.
Yes.
And there weren't too many northern accents in town, so we always thought it was unusual to hear Kenny and Tucker, his brother, and Ronnie and his dad talk. But his dad was a very successful builder, and some of his homes are still in the area, and they're very nice homes. But one of the things I remember about Mr. C was in 1963, Chevrolet came out with a 409 Chevrolet, 425 horsepower. Mr. C went and bought one. And we used to always ask Mr. C to take us over to the Van Croy Theater for the Saturday afternoon matinee, because we knew we would get there in a hurry. Because there weren't many police officers in Indialantic, so all we had to do was get out here on the causeway and say, Mr. C, stand on it. And we have gone across the causeway in very short time in that 409 Chevrolet, and that's the one thing I remember. Your dad had a lot of exotic cars, Lamborghinis. I mean, he was into it, but the one thing I remember as a youngster was watching those Australian pines just clicking off as we went across that causeway in that 409. No seat belts, just hang on. It was fun. Thanks for the memory.
Thanks so much.
I remember, excuse me.
We just have a couple of seconds. Go ahead, and then we'll pass it on for a couple of minutes.
I also remember it's Ed Trader and Georgie Brooks. They built a Jeep, and they put these big balloon tires on it, and we used to be able to drive all the way to the inlet and back on the beach. And we'd drive at night, and nobody would say a word. You could just go all the way. And anyway.
All right, now let's hear from the real river rats, Danny and John.
I was born in the Melbourne Hospital. Barbie Bancroft was my godmother. Who? And yours. And I did, when I was 6 years old, I went to Kay Kovac's acting classes, learned to act. My mom was with the Indian River Players. She was on the founding board of directors there. My grandfather owned the Tradewinds Hotel and the Bahama Beach Club that you all have been talking about. He bought that hotel in 1936 as a retirement hotel. He was in the resort hotel business, and at one time owned 46 hotels up and down the East Coast. So he had had enough after the Depression and decided he was going to retire. In the resort hotel business, you stayed for the season. So in the summertime, you'd go to the Sagamore at Lake George or Forest Hills in New Hampshire, or Upland Terrace in New Hampshire. And in the wintertime, you come down here and stay at the Tradewinds or the Flamingo in Miami, or the Vinoy Park in St. Petersburg, or the San Juan in Orlando. Those were all his hotels. He'd had enough by the time the Depression was over, so he bought the Tradewinds just in time for the war to start. During the war here, there was a real thought from people that the Nazis were going to land on the beach. I mean, this was a real possibility as far as a lot of people were concerned. Tradewinds had a tower, and my grandfather put planks in the beach and would sight a rifle from the tower of the Tradewinds to shoot Nazis on the beach if they landed, in case he had to. But my dad said that at night, you could see the ships burning. For the Nazis, the Germans had torpedoed the ships. And of course, a lot of stuff washed up on the beach. Behind the trade winds was a golf course, and they had a Model A Ford pickup truck called Pluto. Pluto lived on avgas that washed up in big 55-gallon barrels. And so you could always tell where Pluto was at night because of the 3-foot flame coming out of the back of it. And we lived on 11th Avenue, right in front of the trade winds. So at night, I went to sleep with the lullabies of the band playing big band music and listening between that and the sound of the ocean. So going to sleep was a pretty good thing for me when I was 4 years old. We moved over to the river near Miami Avenue, and so I grew up on the water there. And people, when I went to college, would say, "Well, you grew up in Indialantic. You were at the best surfing place in the whole east coast of Florida. Why didn't you surf?" I said, "Because I grew up on the river. I had a sailboat. I learned to swim. I learned to sail. I learned to fish. Why would I go all the way the whole mile to get to the ocean?" I had it right there. We had a 7-foot pram. This was when I was probably 6 years old. Dad took a 100-foot manila rope and tied it to a tree and tied it to the pram, and that was my world. The 100-foot scope, we could fight pirates, and we could be Jacques Cousteau, and we could do everything and still be safe with this 100-foot rope tied to the boat. So eventually it branched out from that. If we waited, there were, John McNeil here is my next door neighbor, and the McNeils had an oyster bed in front of their house. So if you went wading, you had to wear knee-high rubber boots because of the oysters and the stingrays. You could step on a stingray too. So you could look out at any time and see anywhere between 3 and 5 kids out in the water, all wearing rubber boots, looking like firemen, stomping around in the water out there. And we learned to sail. I learned to sail from John. They had a sailfish. And every afternoon when I'd come home, I'd go out in the boat. We started off with just rowing the boat and eventually got a little motor and then a bigger motor. And our boundaries were able to expand eventually to the Sewell's dock. That was as far as we could go. And then to the causeway. The rule was you had to be back by sundown. And so I figured as long as Dad could see me coming home by sundown, that was close enough. So the amazing thing about it was now is I've got 2 kids. They're 20 and 22, and they grew up in organized sports, and we didn't have that. We grew up on the river. My dad, I guess he figured that if you could learn to take care of yourself on the river in a boat and not get into trouble, you certainly didn't need to go to a pinball arcade or a pool hall. And so it instilled quite a bit of self-confidence and self-sufficiency in us. And John and I have been in more than one sticky situation in the river, and we always managed to come out alive.
You know, Danny, it's great to hear you say this, because what it tells you is what a great place this was and is. How safe and how wonderful, and maybe we should work on making our community a closer community, because everyone is responsible for each other, and that's the way it was. I mean, Marcia and I got away with nothing because someone saw everything we did. And they didn't just see it, they told our parents. And so you ended up learning to do the right things. And maybe that's where we ought to be heading. John,
Yep.
you're my last little baby.
Okay, I'll try to keep it short. What he's talking about is very much true, that being next door to each other, it was easy for us to just throw boats in the water when we came home. The other kids would be putting surfboards on their bikes and heading to the beach, and we had all we needed to play with right there. And it was good at learning nature. You learn self-esteem. You earned the self-esteem because, as he said, you could survive on the boats. We had times when we were out sailing in winds that were so high that we would probably be much smarter if we hadn't been, but we had a lot of fun. We came back one time and hit the shoreline so hard on a 15-foot fiberglass sailboat, slid up the grass in the vacant lot between our houses. The boat slid up next to the pine tree. I'm stripping the sails off the boat while he's lashing the boat to the tree because the leading wall of the hurricane is coming across the river right behind us. And I ran to my house with the sails, threw them down. He ran to his house, and my phone's ringing when I get there. And I pick up the phone, and all it is Dan on the other end going, bah, and then click. We had a lot of fun around here. There was a neat thing about being on the water. Indialantic has two names. India is the other part. The Atlantic is what people focus on a lot, but they forget about what happened in the river. Dick Hunter from Fifth Avenue Cleaners used to have hydroplane races out there. We had sailing regattas out there. We used to launch boats right from this edge of the causeway, right near the relief bridge. There was a place to launch boats there. Kathy Johnson's father, and Bill Smith and some others were racing 505s. This area is such a good sailing venue that the fellow came over from England to figure out why are all these people in Melbourne buying these 505 racing boats. And he went out sailing with me on the river on the 50, and he looked around and he says, how can you fit, why can we fit a boat on this water? And he said, in England, we launch on mud puddles. And this is amazing to him to see this venue. Water is 1.75 miles wide, and predominant southeast trade winds, and deep enough water to be really useful. And there are places like you were talking about, the shoals, the spoil banks. Those were built, the islands were built when they dredged the intercoastal waterway. And they were quite a place to play because you were out there as kids, you had 1 mile of open water around you. Now, do you imagine that as teenagers we set off any kind of munitions on that island? We blew holes in that island, I'm afraid to say, but it was part of what was going up around here and good fun. There was one quick story I also would tell about being on the river. You always get to watch what's going on out there. My sister and I were sitting there one time as typical kids saying, oh, we're bored, we're bored. And Mom sat us in the corner window in the second floor overlooking the river and says, okay, if you can sit here and count to 10 and not see something, then we'll figure out what to do with y'all. But in the meantime, we sat there and we started counting. We couldn't get over 8. There would be a porpoise come by, there would be a fish jump, there would be a bird. There was always something going on. And also watching there was a case where a barge was coming up the river one time. Nobody mentioned the Saturn barges, the big Saturn barges that came up with the first stage of the Saturn V's. There would be reports all the way up and down the waterway that this thing's coming. And people would go out there and stand on the bridge. And this thing went through, and the deck was almost at the level of the bridge itself when the bridge was open. But there was another barge coming through one time with a big wind behind him late at night. And 2 shorts and a long. You kept hearing the 2 shorts and the long. And no response. And the gates didn't light up. The bridge wasn't doing anything. So the tugboat captain has now got a problem in his hands. He's got steam and momentum, and I don't think he's going to be able to stop this thing. He's got his searchlight dancing all over the bridge tender's building. And so my mom thinks, oh, this is interesting. So she gets out the phone book, telephones the bridge tender, and says, look to your south. And all you heard was this momentary gasp, and the phone hit, and then the red lights went on and the bells went on. It caught him snoozing.
Thank you so much. We could go on and on and on, but you guys have been absolutely wonderful. I cannot tell you who told the truth and who did not, but I have some ideas. A quick 2 seconds. Does anybody have a question or something they would like to add? Tell us your name, please.
By the way, I'm Denise's father, and this is her mother, Shirley. I don't know if you remember or not, it was back in the 50s, down on Indialantic Beach, this elderly lady would bring a big black dog down there, and she'd let the dog out with his ball. And if you're laying down on the beach, the dog would come up with his ball, and you had to play with him. Every morning at 9 o'clock, she'd bring that big black dog. At 12 o'clock, she'd come, blow her horn, the dog would leave, get his ball, and he'd leave. And it went on for months and months. And then the city city come out with an ordinance, no dogs on the beach. And I never did see the dog anymore.
Loretta Foy and my husband and I, Les, arrived here in 1967, and my previous place of living was New Orleans, Washington, D.C., and Miami. And I know I was just, shopping was kind of an important thing to me. And all there was in the Babcock, I think it's called the Marketplace, was a little Montgomery Ward's, on the other side a little Penny's, and down the street the same Sears is now there. And so I do remember how elated most of us were. We had to go to Orlando for anything big shopping, but how elated we were when the mall was built. I'm not sure the year, but it was an exciting thing.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And the one thing we didn't mention, and I'm going to talk about it right now, is just for a second, is at one time, Indialantic's Fifth Avenue was a very elegant shopping center. It had the Bandbox, it had Nancy Powers, it had Dot Shoe, Sharon Wilkins' Papagallo shop. It was an absolutely elegant place to shop. J. Russell Linens. Thank you all so much for coming. A nice panel.
Deanne, you did a great job, didn't she, you guys? I think she did. Thank you.